Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I hope everyone can hear me. How to respond to a lot of this? First of all, on the bar, you said you admitted yourself that the bar had been set quite high. I would suggest, though, that the burden of proof is on the proposer rather than on us. It quite clearly says Islam is a religion of peace. I suggest you prove it. We've also been told here tonight when we opened, that this debate must take place in the real world. Well, absolutely, yes, it must. It must take place in the real world. And I will describe what Islam is doing in the real world. We can sit and we can debate theocracy day in, day out. We will never agree. We can debate, is there a God, isn't there a God, is the Quran real, isn't it? None of it actually matters. What matters is what happens in the real world, as my opponent quite rightly said. My side of the argument is regularly told that we've heard it again tonight, we were described somewhat as hate. We were told that we are demonizing Islam, whipping up fear of Islam. Not the first time I've been accused of this, probably won't be the last. But let me just say, and let's take this into the real world as we've been advised to do, let me tell you what actually whips up fears of Islam. We would take it from the top: 9/11, the London Underground bombings, Madrid, Mumbai, Mali, Bali, northern Nigeria, Sudan, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, Pakistan, death for apostasy, death for blasphemy, death for adultery, death for homosexuality, gender segregation, gender discrimination, unequal testimony between men and women in legal proceedings, child marriage, amputations, beheadings, imprisonment for being raped, anti-Semitism, burqas, execution, as I've said, for this, that and the other, the slaughter of Theo van Gogh on the streets of Amsterdam, death threats on the streets of London, butcher those who insult Islam, Muslim patrols in East London telling people they are entering Sharia-controlled zones, polygamous marriages, marriage not requiring the consent of the bride. This is what causes fear of Islam. It is not me, it is not my colleagues on this side.
Point of information on that point. If Islam and Muslims are responsible for the Muslim patrols,
I'm not finished. I'm not. No, okay. I'm not. I mean, let me speak on. But the point is that it is not I or my fellow debaters on this side who are causing fear of Islam. It is the actions of Muslims that are causing fear of Islam. That is the real world. That is where we actually live. Then we'll be told that this is just the extreme fringe of Islam. Well, let me have a look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam, the custodian of its holy sites. In Saudi Arabia, a woman is not allowed to drive. She is not allowed to leave the house without a mahram. She is not allowed to vote, although they've been incredibly generous by allowing some votes in the next elections. This is apparently the extreme fringe of people are executed for blasphemy, executed for apostasy. In Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, we'll be told that's the extreme fringe of Islam. No, it is not. Calling Saudi Arabia the extreme fringe of Islam is like calling the Vatican the extreme fringe of Catholicism. Sorry, it just doesn't work. Then we'll be told that we've misunderstood. Violent Muslims have misunderstood. Saudi Arabia has misunderstood. Iran, which stones people to death for adultery, has misunderstood. Yemen, which marries children at the age of 9, has misunderstood. Has there ever been a more spectacularly misunderstood religion than Islam? It seems that these nations who apply it as their laws, nations which have the Quran as their constitution, innumerable nations, where there is no free speech, where there is no freedom of religion, they've all got it wrong. They've all got it wrong. It's quite a spectacularly misunderstood religion. There's just so much. I'm constantly told as well that I need to respect Islam. I'm never quite given a good enough reason why. I am under no greater obligation to respect Islam than I am any other beliefs. I'm under no more obligation to respect a woman oppressed in the name of Islam than if she is oppressed by the BNP or anyone else. I am under no obligation to make compromises with an ideology I simply don't see as peaceful. Why don't I see it as peaceful? Because of the evidence. If I look around the world and I see the countries where Islam calls the shots, all I see is brutality and violence imposed by the state. We were told that peace is not just the absence of violence but the presence of justice. Absolutely. I do not see how in a nation where, as the only woman here, I have some particular issues with the way women are treated in Islamic states. Now you can argue that they've got it wrong. Tell them that, because they seem to think that's what it is. Yes, I mean, there's so much to say about it, but is there a peaceful Islam? Yes, there is. It's in the hearts of peaceful Muslims. Unfortunately, though, there's also a rather more objective Islam, and peaceful Muslims have to do some really rather creative interpretation, like the command to beat her. I've seen Muslim women... I didn't stand up for you. Well, I didn't. So if you could just have a bit... I knew this would happen. I knew this would happen, by the way. I knew this would happen. What I'm saying is completely controversial and will be booed and shouted down, and I have no doubt my colleagues the same. I knew this would happen. You say anything negative, you'll get the boos. I'm actually going to leave it there. But I will finish just by saying this. There are hundreds of millions of peaceful Muslims. That is a fact. But that does not mean that Islam itself is peaceful. Peaceful Muslims interpret verses of the Quran so almost beyond recognition. It's reinterpreted, like the command to beat her. It's there in the Quran, and I've seen Muslim women try to dance around it. They put words in there that simply aren't there. That's what it says. It says beat her. And in the countries where the Quran calls the shots, that is exactly what they do. This is not peace. This is not justice. Islam is not a religion of peace, as the evidence shows us. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today, the 10 brutal realities of life in Stalin's Soviet Union. When Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, his charismatic henchman Leon Trotsky seemed to be his most obvious successor. Instead, it was Joseph Stalin, a man once described by Trotsky as a dull grey blur and a non-entity who had, by 1929, vanquished his political rivals and seized power for himself. The self-proclaimed Man of Steel would rule over the Soviet Union until his death in 1953. Over the course of a little more than 2 decades, he transformed the Soviet Union from a technologically backward agricultural society into a nuclear-armed superpower. Remarkable as this feat was, it was achieved through suffering on a colossal scale. Stalin's Soviet Union was billed as a workers' paradise. Instead, it was a terrifying police state presided over by one of history's most brutal dictators. Number 10. The Soviet famine of 1932 to 1933. In 1929, about 80% of Russia's population worked the land. Their way of life had been largely unchanged for generations. That was until Stalin launched what has been described as a civil war against the peasant class. Stalin's goal was to modernize agriculture in order to drive the rapid industrialization that he saw essential to the Soviet Union's future. The wealthier peasants, denounced by Stalin as rural capitalists, were executed or deported to prison camps in Siberia. The remainder were stripped of their land and livestock and forced to work the fields of the vast state-run collective farms. Many peasants chose to slaughter their livestock rather than hand it over to the state, resulting in catastrophic shortages. Grain production fell, but state quotas had to be met. The army and the secret police took all that could be found, leaving whole villages to starve. Any peasant found stealing a single grain could simply be shot. In towns and cities, mass graves were dug. In villages, the corpses were often left piled up by the side of the road, the living too weak to bury the dead. As the people suffered and starved, Stalin exported huge quantities of food abroad to fund the industrialization of the Soviet Union. The famine of 1932 to 1933 had been entirely preventable, but it caused the death of millions. Number 9. The Great Terror. Stalin's brutal methods and growing power were a cause of grave concern amongst at least some members of the Soviet leadership. In early 1934, at the 7th Congress of the Committee of the Communist Party, Stalin received more than 100 anonymous negative votes. This only strengthened his conviction that enemies and traitors were everywhere, plotting his downfall. Determined to eradicate any possible threat to his position, Stalin began a purge of his own party, targeting enemies, both real and perceived. More than half of the 1,996 who attended the 17th Congress had been arrested by the end of 1939. Most were executed by Stalin's secret police, but others were put to work in the labor camps of icy Siberia. Few of them ever returned. The Great Terror was not confined to party elites either. Stalin intended to kill anybody who might pose a potential threat. Whether they had actually committed a crime was no protection. Intellectuals, scientists, and artists were all targeted. The Red Army itself was also by no means exempt, and thousands of its officers, suspected of disloyalty, were removed from their posts or executed. The purges spread like a contagion through the ranks and society. Even the innocent would confess to crimes and name friends and acquaintances as accomplices, anything to make the torture stop. The process would then repeat itself with a new set of victims. By the end of 1938, as the Great Terror began to wind down, more than 1 million people had been arrested and 500,000 were executed. Stalin's grip on power was assured, and all understood that the merest hint of disloyalty or criticism would be met with brutal retribution. Number 8. The activities of the NKVD were an open secret. The secret police went by numerous different names over the course of the Soviet Union's 69 years of existence, but from 1934 until Stalin's death in 1953, they were known as the NKVD. Above the law and separate from the party, the NKVD answered to Stalin alone. It was the instrument through which Stalin inflicted terror on a population of more than 170 million, and one of the main pillars on which his power rested. An entirely rational fear of the secret police permeated all levels of Soviet society. Almost everyone had a friend or relative who'd vanished and never been seen again. It was understood, yet rarely mentioned, that the NKVD were responsible for the disappearances. The activities of the secret police were an open secret. To mention their existence carried a very real risk of a visit. Any man elevated to head of the NKVD wielded power second only to that of Stalin. This meant their position was a dangerous one. The first chief of the NKVD, Genrikh Yagoda, was himself arrested, tortured, and executed on Stalin's orders. His successor, Nikolai Yezhov, nicknamed the Poison Dwarf due to his short stature, suffered the same fate. Number 7. Stalin's right-hand man was a sadist and a serial killer. Only an individual of exceptional cruelty and cunning could hope to survive for any great length of time as the chief of Stalin's NKVD. The unassuming-looking Lavrentiy Beria was just such a man. Described by Stalin's daughter as an evil genius who surpassed even her father in the dark political arts, Beria was perhaps the most depraved of all of Stalin's creatures. Appointed as the chief of the NKVD in place of Nikolai Yezhov, Beria was a sycophantic crawler who did everything in his power to ingratiate himself with Stalin, the man he called the boss. He was also a man who thoroughly enjoyed his job. Reported to be capable of going days on end without sleep, he delighted in presiding over marathon torture sessions. When Beria wasn't killing in his professional capacity as Stalin's attack dog, he did so for his own amusement. His henchmen were under the instruction to roam the streets, seeking out young women and girls for him to rape and murder. There's little doubt that Stalin must have been aware of Beria's activities, but the Soviet dictator prized loyalty and efficiency over all else and cared nothing for the suffering of others. Beria's loyalty, however, was not as complete as Stalin imagined. When Stalin died in 1953, Beria spat on his corpse and smiled. Most likely, he believed that he would replace his former master as dictator, but with Stalin's protection lost, he was instead arrested and sentenced to death for his many crimes. Beria, the merciless killer, broke down in tears and pleaded for his life. His screams were muffled by a rag stuffed in his mouth before he was shot in the head. Number 6. Suppression of religion. Karl Marx famously described religion as the opium of the people. He saw religion as a tool used by the ruling capitalist class to oppress the proletariat. There would be no need for religion in a properly functioning communist society, and this alone would have been reason enough for Stalin to attempt to eradicate it. However, Stalin had another motivation too. He hated the idea that his people might believe in a power even greater than his own. Russian Orthodoxy was the dominant religion in the Soviet Union, but there were also substantial numbers of Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and others. The process of attempting to stamp out religion, it began under Lenin, but it accelerated under Stalin. Religious works of literature were banned, and atheism was promoted in schools. Worshippers were harassed, their places of worship closed or even destroyed, and priests and preachers were targeted by the secret police. Number 5. The Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler's Nazi Germany launched an attack of unprecedented scale against Stalin's Soviet Union. The titanic clash between the two totalitarian powers would decide the outcome of World War II. In the Soviet Union, the struggle became known as the Great Patriotic War. No other nation on Earth would have been able to withstand such an enormous attack. Very few individuals in history other than Stalin would have been so inured to the suffering of their people as to pay the price required to repel it. As the Red Army fell back under the weight of the onslaught, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy. Wells were poisoned, crops were burned in the fields, farm animals slaughtered, and entire towns destroyed. No consideration was given as to how civilians would survive in the blackened wastelands that they had once called home. Stalin demanded that civilians and soldiers alike be prepared to pay any price to keep him in power. The Red Army was the largest army in the world, but its soldiers were badly equipped and badly trained. To guard against the possibility of them fleeing from the enemy, battalions armed with machine guns were stationed to the rear of the lines of battle. They were ready to gun down any man who lost their nerve and attempted to escape. With Germany's eventual defeat in May of 1941, Stalin's power and international prestige were at an all-time high. But the Soviet Union had lost between 20 and 42 million people. Number 4. Prisoners of war were treated as traitors. When Germany surrendered to the Allies in May of 1945, more than 6 million Red Army soldiers had been taken prisoner by the Germans. Millions more civilians had been captured and put to work as slave laborers in the Reich. Many were now in territory controlled by the British and the Americans, and Stalin demanded that they be returned to the Soviet Union. The Western Allies saw no reason to refuse what seemed to be a reasonable request, and from the chaos of post-war Europe, some 4 million people were repatriated. In Stalin's paranoid mind, though, to be captured by the enemy was in and of itself an act of treachery and betrayal. This applied even to his own family. Stalin's son had been captured by the Germans in 1941, but the Soviet dictator refused to do a deal to secure his release. Soldiers and civilians returning to the Soviet Union found themselves fed into camps for interrogation by the NKVD. The lucky ones were eventually freed to return home, but the merest suspicion of having collaborated with the Germans meant execution or a visit to the labor camps in Siberia. Number 3. The most powerful men in the Soviet Union were routinely humiliated. Joseph Stalin did have a sense of humor, but not a healthy one. While he never forgot or forgave a perceived insult to himself, he took great amusement in the suffering and humiliation of others. One of the Soviet dictator's favorite pastimes was to stay up until the small hours of the morning drinking with his acolytes. Coming as he did from Georgian peasant stock, Stalin was capable of consuming alcohol in prodigious quantities. Frequently, however, he would drink only water, whilst forcing his comrades to knock back enough alcohol to reduce them to stumbling, insensible buffoons. Nikita Khrushchev, who was a powerful enough individual within the Soviet Union to go on to succeed Stalin following the dictator's death in 1953, recalled how he was once forced to perform a traditional Cossack dance for Stalin's amusement. The ungainly and awkward Khrushchev possessed many talents, but complicated, physically challenging dance routines were not amongst them. Nonetheless, as Khrushchev later explained, when Stalin says dance, a wise man dances. Number 2. Siberian gulags. With average temperatures well below freezing throughout the winter and into April, and thousands of kilometers of land that remains frozen throughout the year, Siberia has long been one of the most unforgiving climates on Earth. Used as a dumping ground for political prisoners and criminals since the mid-1700s, even Stalin had spent some time in prison there during the early days of his career as a revolutionary. The system of Siberian labor camps already existed when Stalin came to power, but they were vastly extended under his rule. Differing from the death camps of Nazi Germany in that they were not explicitly explicitly run with the intention of murdering their inmates, conditions in the gulags were nonetheless appalling. Starvation was a constant threat, and it wasn't unknown for the inhabitants of entire camps, including the prisoners, guards, and even their dogs, to simply freeze to death. Historian Roy Alexandrovich Medvedev estimated that up to 6 million people may have been sentenced to Stalin's gulags. Perhaps 1 million or more of those didn't survive the experience. Number 1. The cult of Stalin. Stalin might have been a ruthless dictator with the blood of millions on his hands, but that wasn't the image that he wanted to project to the people. Soviet propaganda, it portrayed Stalin as a powerful yet benevolent father figure, a genius who devoted his life to the service of the Soviet Union and to the protection of his people. Only rarely did he appear in public, but his portrait adorns the wall of every office, every factory, every classroom, and indeed most people's homes. Radio and newspapers hailed his genius. Schools taught a rewritten version of history which wildly exaggerated his importance in the momentous events of the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Anyone who spoke of Stalin in anything less than terms of gushing praise was ruthlessly silenced. Unlike dictators such as Hitler and Mussolini, Stalin was a poor public speaker, but when Stalin finished speaking, the crowds erupted in applause. His audience understood that the NKVD would be watching, and being the first person to stop clapping could be a death sentence. Stalin's cult of personality was so successful that the brutal dictator's death was mourned by millions in 1953. So I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed that video, but I at least hope you found it interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and do not forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, check out some videos from the archives over there on the right. Also got a brand new channel. It's called Biographics. We've actually done a biographic on Stalin, so please check out the link below. And as always, thank you for watching.